Be me, Rachel, 29, working in corporate accounting for 3 years. Finally landed a decent job at mid-sized consulting firm after grinding through entry-level positions. Wake up every morning knowing I'm making a difference by calling out workplace inequality. Today starts like any other day, reviewing quarterly reports and preparing for afternoon meeting. Notice immediately that David scheduled our project review for 2 p.m. in Conference Room B. Conference Room B has glass walls completely visible to entire office. This is obviously intentional, another microaggression designed to make me feel surveilled. David could have easily chosen Conference Room A, which has privacy and better acoustics. But no, he deliberately picks the fishbowl room where everyone can watch us. Classic power move, establishing dominance through environmental control. Decide to address this head-on rather than let it slide like I used to. March over to David's desk around 10:30 a.m. Hey David, I noticed you booked Conference Room B for our meeting today. Yeah, it was the only one available for that time slot. Actually, I checked the system and Conference Room A was open from 2 to 4 p.m. David looks uncomfortable, starts fidgeting with his pen. Oh well, Room B has the better projector setup for the presentation. David, we're reviewing spreadsheets. We don't need a projector. Can see him getting flustered as I dismantle his weak excuses one by one. Look, Rachel, Room B is fine. Let's just stick with what's booked. This is about visibility, isn't it? You want other people to see our meeting. What? No, that's ridiculous. It's a classic intimidation tactic, choosing the most exposed meeting space to make me feel vulnerable. David's face is getting red now. Exactly the reaction I expected. Rachel, you're reading way too much into a simple room booking. Am I, though? Because this fits a clear pattern of behavior. Spend next 10 minutes explaining how room selection reflects unconscious bias. Point out how male colleagues consistently get private offices for sensitive discussions. Meanwhile, women are relegated to open spaces where their conversations can be monitored. David keeps trying to interrupt, but I stay focused and methodical. Present evidence of previous meetings, document the disparity in room assignments. Finally, he agrees to switch to Conference Room A. Small victory, but these add up over time. Systemic change happens through persistent challenge of everyday inequities. Feel energized knowing I successfully advocated for myself. This is exactly why women need to speak up instead of accepting unfair treatment. Around 11:45 a.m., decide to grab coffee before lunch. Break room is usually empty this time of day, perfect for quick caffeine fix. Can hear voices as I approach the coffee station. Recognize David's voice immediately, sounds stressed. Also, hear Oliver from IT and James from sales. They're speaking in hushed tones near the microwave. Not intentionally eavesdropping, but their conversation is clearly audible. I'm telling you guys, it's getting out of hand, David is saying. She spent 15 minutes lecturing me about room assignments this morning. Everything is some kind of conspiracy or microaggression with her. Pause behind the corner, coffee cup in hand. Should probably announce my presence, but curiosity gets the better of me. Remember last month when she filed that complaint about the office temperature, Oliver says, claimed the thermostat was set to favor male comfort levels. Had to sit through a whole HR meeting about HVAC gender bias. They're talking about me, obviously. Feel mix of vindication and frustration. Vindication because they're proving my point about dismissive male attitudes. Frustration because they're completely missing the substance of my concerns. And don't get me started on the parking lot incident, James adds. She accused me of mansplaining when I offered to help her change that flat tire. Apparently suggesting she might need assistance was patronizing and sexist. I was just trying to be helpful, you know? Roll my eyes internally. James completely misunderstood that situation. Offering help wasn't the problem. It was his assumption that I couldn't handle it myself. Look, I get that workplace equality is important, David continues, but she makes everything into some huge feminist issue. Can't have a normal conversation without getting a lecture about patriarchal structures. Yesterday she told me that saying you guys is exclusionary language. Suggested I say team or everyone instead. I mean, come on, it's just an expression. Want to march in there and explain why language matters. How seemingly innocent phrases reinforce gender hierarchies. but decide to keep listening, gather intelligence about their attitudes. Knowledge is power in these situations. Better to understand their perspective before responding. The thing is, she's actually good at her job, Oliver admits. Those quarterly projections she prepared were really solid. But working with her feels like walking through a minefield. Never know what innocent comment is going to trigger the next diversity seminar. Interesting that he acknowledges my competence. Shows their resistance isn't based on questioning my abilities. It's purely about discomfort with having their privilege challenged. That's exactly the problem, James says. She's smart and she knows it. Uses every interaction as an opportunity to educate us about our unconscious bias. Makes you feel like you're constantly being judged and found wanting. They're describing my efforts to raise awareness as if it's somehow problematic. Classic deflection technique, making the messenger into the problem. Honestly, I've started avoiding one-on-one meetings with her, David says. Too risky. You never know what might get misconstrued. Last time we worked, late on that budget analysis, she mentioned how the office lighting creates an intimidating atmosphere after hours. Made this whole connection between masculine-coded workspaces and women's sense of safety. Had to listen to 20 minutes about environmental psychology and gender dynamics. Remember that conversation clearly. Was trying to help David understand why late meetings can feel different for women. Apparently, he interpreted educational discussion as personal attack. I hear you, man, Oliver responds. Same here. I always make sure there are other people around when we need to collaborate. Document everything. Keep witnesses present. It's just safer that way. Heart starts beating faster as the implications sink in. They're actively avoiding private interactions with me, treating me like some kind of threat or liability. This goes beyond simple disagreement about workplace issues. They're systematically excluding me from normal professional relationships. We should probably establish this as a policy between us, James suggests. Just to protect ourselves. Never be alone with her. Ever. The words hit like a physical blow. Never be alone with her, ever. They're talking about me like I'm dangerous. Like I'm some predator they need to defend themselves against. That's probably smart, David agrees. I'll make sure Oliver is included in any project meetings going forward. And if she wants to discuss something sensitive, I'll insist on having HR present. Better safe than sorry. Feel tears starting to form in my eyes. This is so much worse than I imagined. Thought I was building bridges, creating dialogue, fostering understanding. Instead, I've apparently become persona non grata in my own workplace. They're creating formal protocols to avoid being alone with me. It's not that we don't respect her, Oliver says. She's obviously passionate about these issues. But you can't have a normal working relationship when every conversation turns into a teaching moment about systemic oppression. It's exhausting, Want to scream that educating people about inequality shouldn't be my job. But someone has to do it. And clearly they're not going to learn on their own. Exactly, James says. And God forbid you disagree with her about anything. Remember when she explained how me holding the door was actually an expression of benevolent sexism? Apparently I was reinforcing gender stereotypes about women needing assistance. Now, I have no idea how to act around her. Back away from the coffee station quietly. Don't want them to know I overheard their conversation. Need time to process what I just learned. Head back to my desk feeling completely shaken. Sit down and stare at my computer screen. Words from their conversation keep echoing in my head. Never be alone with her, ever. How did things get to this point? All I wanted was to create a more equitable workplace, to help my colleagues understand how their behavior affects women. Instead, I've apparently made myself into some kind of pariah. They see me as a threat rather than an ally. This is the opposite of what I was trying to achieve. Spend the rest of the morning replaying recent interactions, trying to see them from their perspective. Maybe I have been coming on too strong, but how else are you supposed to address workplace inequality? If you don't speak up, nothing changes. If you do speak up, people get defensive and resentful. It's an impossible situation. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. The afternoon meeting with David approaches. Now I understand why he wanted conference room B. He wanted witnesses present, protection against whatever he imagines I might do. The whole room booking argument this morning makes perfect sense now. He wasn't trying to intimidate me. He was trying to protect himself. Feel foolish for misreading the situation so completely. 2 p.m. arrives, and I walk into conference room A. David shows up with Oliver in tow. Hope you don't mind, I asked Oliver to join us, David says. He's been working on some related financial modeling. Oliver looks uncomfortable, clearly doesn't want to be there. Now I know the real reason for his presence. They're implementing their never alone policy already. Try to focus on the quarterly projections, but keep getting distracted. Every comment feels loaded with subtext now. When I suggest adjustments to the revenue forecasts, David nods politely but doesn't engage. No back and forth discussion like we used to have, just perfunctory agreement designed to end the conversation quickly. Oliver takes notes on everything, creating their precious documentation. Meeting wraps up in half the expected time. Normally, David and I would spend another 20 minutes discussing implementation details. Today, he's clearly eager to escape. Great work on these projections, Rachel, he says formally. Oliver and I will review the recommendations and get back to you. They're treating me like an outside consultant rather than a team member. Polite, professional, but completely impersonal. Watch them leave together, probably going to debrief about our interaction. Sit alone in the conference room feeling completely isolated. This isn't what I wanted at all. I wanted connection, understanding, progress toward equality. Instead, I've created an environment where my colleagues feel they need protection from me. Rest of the week follows the same pattern. Every interaction is carefully managed and witnessed. James makes sure other people are around when discussing the client presentation. Oliver brings a colleague to our monthly systems review. Even casual conversations feel stilted and artificial. They're friendly enough on the surface, but there's an invisible barrier now. They know that I know, even though we've never acknowledged the overheard conversation. The dynamic has fundamentally shifted. I've become the problem that needs to be managed, rather than the colleague they collaborate with. All those discussions about workplace equality that I thought were productive. Apparently, they experienced them as lectures and accusations. Friday afternoon, sitting at my desk reviewing the week. Realized that in trying to fix workplace inequality, I might have made it worse, at least for myself. My male colleagues now see me as a liability to be carefully handled, rather than a person to build genuine professional relationships with. They're not learning about unconscious bias. They're just developing better defense mechanisms. Sophisticated strategies for avoiding any behavior that might trigger my feminist analysis. The conversations continue, but they're sanitized and meaningless, stripped of the authentic human connection that makes work relationships valuable. They comply with my requests, but don't internalize the reasoning behind them. Surface-level behavioral modification without any deeper understanding. Wonder if there was a different approach I could have taken. Maybe more gradual, less confrontational. But then again, how long should women wait for men to figure out equality on their own? How many microaggressions should we tolerate while waiting for organic change? The whole situation feels like a trap with no good options. Speak up and be labeled as difficult and overly sensitive. Stay quiet and watch inequality perpetuate itself unchecked. There's no winning strategy when the system is designed to resist change. My colleagues aren't evil people, they're just comfortable with the status quo. Challenging that comfort was always going to create friction. Maybe I underestimated how much friction they were willing to tolerate. Monday morning, decide to try a different approach. Instead of addressing systemic issues directly, focus on building better individual relationships. Maybe if they see me as a person first, they'll be more receptive to learning later. Walk into the break room where David is, making coffee. Morning, David. How was your weekend? He looks up nervously, glances around to see who else is present. Oh, hi Rachel. Weekend was good, just did some yard work. Clearly wants to end the conversation quickly. I've been thinking about our project timeline, I continue. Maybe we could grab lunch sometime this week and discuss the next phase. David's face goes pale. Actually, I think it would be better to handle that in our regular team meetings. More efficient that way, keeps everyone in the loop. Translation, not happening without witnesses. Try the same approach with Oliver later in the day. Hey, Oliver, I noticed some inconsistencies in the database queries. Could you walk me through the logic when you have a chance? Sure, let me set up a meeting with the whole IT team. We can review the entire system architecture together. Again, refusing any one-on-one interaction, they've turned my desire for workplace equality into a scarlet letter, marking me as someone who can't be trusted with private conversations. Every attempt at normal professional relationship gets deflected through group settings. They're treating me like I have some contagious disease. The disease of asking uncomfortable questions about gender dynamics. By Wednesday, the isolation is really getting to me. Used to enjoy coming to work, felt like I was part of a team. Now it feels like being tolerated rather than welcomed. Included in group settings but carefully excluded from informal interactions. The spontaneous conversations that build real workplace relationships. Coffee breaks, casual problem-solving sessions, after-hours collaboration. All of that has dried up completely. I'm functionally quarantined within my own office. My colleagues have found a way to be technically inclusive while remaining emotionally distant. They've figured out how to neutralize my impact without appearing overtly discriminatory. Thursday afternoon, overhear David talking to James near the printer. She seems different this week, David says. Less confrontational. Maybe she's finally getting the message. Could be, though I'm still not taking any chances. Better to maintain the boundaries we established. Getting the message. They think my quieter approach means I've given up on workplace equality, that I've learned my lesson about challenging male privilege. But really, I'm just trying to figure out a more effective strategy. The direct approach clearly backfired. Need to find a way to create change without triggering their defensive responses. Problem is, once you're labeled as the difficult feminist, everything you do gets interpreted through that lens. Friday evening, reflecting on the whole situation, realize that my male colleagues have essentially won without having to change anything. They've successfully isolated the troublemaker while maintaining plausible deniability. Can claim they're treating me professionally while ensuring I have no real influence. They've created a system where I can voice concerns in formal settings, but have no informal channels to build the relationships that actually drive change. It's a sophisticated form of workplace marginalization, technically compliant with HR policies, but effectively exclusionary. They've learned to manage the feminist threat rather than address the underlying issues. My passionate advocacy for equality has been neutralized through strategic avoidance, sitting in my car after work, feeling completely defeated. Started this job 3 years ago with such optimism. Thought I could make a difference by raising awareness about gender inequality. Instead, I've made myself into a cautionary tale. The woman who talks too much about feminism and makes everyone uncomfortable. They've turned my commitment to justice into a personal failing. Reframed systemic inequality as my individual problem. Now I'm the one who needs to modify my behavior, while they continue operating exactly as they always have, just with better defensive strategies to protect themselves from accountability. The worst part is understanding that they genuinely see themselves as the victims. In their minds, I'm the aggressor who forced them into these protective measures. They're not discriminating against me. They're defending themselves against false accusations. They're not avoiding accountability. They're maintaining professional boundaries. They've constructed a narrative where my advocacy for equality becomes harassment, and their systematic exclusion becomes reasonable self-preservation. It's a perfect inversion of the power dynamic, turning the oppressed into the oppressor through clever reframing. Wonder how many other women have gone through similar experiences. How many times has passionate advocacy been neutralized through strategic isolation? How many feminists have been marginalized by being labeled as difficult or extreme? The system doesn't need to silence women directly anymore. It just needs to make the cost of speaking up higher than the cost of staying quiet. Make advocacy so socially expensive that most people choose compliance. My colleagues didn't need to fire me or formally discipline me. They just needed to make work uncomfortable enough that I'd self-regulate. Modify my own behavior to avoid further conflict. Start to understand why so many women choose to keep their heads down, why they focus on individual advancement rather than systemic change, why they avoid being labeled as the office feminist. Because once you get that label, your effectiveness is permanently compromised. You become the person others warn each other about, the one who makes simple interactions complicated and risky. Better to work within the system quietly than challenge it openly. At least that way you maintain relationships and career prospects, even if you never actually change anything meaningful. Monday morning, decide to test my theory. Walk into the office and greet everyone, normally. Don't mention gender, equality, microaggressions, or systemic bias. Just focus on work tasks and neutral professional conversation. Immediately notice the difference in how people respond. David actually smiles when discussing the quarterly reports. Oliver makes eye contact during our team meeting. James includes me in his joke about the new coffee machine. They're relieved that I'm acting normal, again, that the difficult feminist phase seems to be over. Spend the next few weeks maintaining this new persona. Bite my tongue when David interrupts me 3 times during the budget presentation. Say nothing when the new hire gets assigned the high-profile client that I was promised. Ignore the fact that every company social event revolves around traditionally masculine activities. Pretend not to notice when Oliver consistently explains basic concepts that I already understand. Watch my female colleagues get talked over in meetings without speaking up. Become complicit in the very system I used to challenge. But my relationships with male colleagues gradually improve. They start including me in informal conversations again. Invite me to lunch meetings and after-work drinks. By the end of the month, I've been successfully reintegrated into the team. They trust me not to turn every interaction into a lecture about privilege. I'm back to being seen as a competent colleague rather than a walking HR liability. The never be alone with her ever policy has been quietly abandoned. David schedules one-on-one meetings without bringing chaperones. Oliver asks for my input on technical problems without documenting our conversations. James even holds doors for me again, confident that I won't analyze the gender implications. I've learned to be the kind of woman they're comfortable with. Professional, competent, but careful not to challenge their worldview too directly. The irony is overwhelming. Succeeded in rebuilding professional relationships by abandoning the principles that mattered most to me. Gained acceptance by accepting inequality. They think I've matured and become more reasonable. Really, I've just learned to hide my convictions better, to pick battles more carefully, to package feminist concerns in language that doesn't trigger their defensive responses. It's not progress, it's just more sophisticated oppression. Teaching women to advocate for equality in ways that don't make men uncomfortable, which means not advocating very effectively at all. 3 months later, sitting in my car after another productive workday. Successful project completed, positive feedback from supervisors, good relationships with colleagues. Everything is going well professionally, except I feel like I've betrayed everything I used to believe in, become complicit in maintaining the very inequalities I once fought against. My male colleagues learn that they can neutralize feminist advocacy through strategic social pressure. No need for formal retaliation or explicit discrimination. Just make advocacy socially costly enough that women choose silence. They've successfully trained me to self-censor, to prioritize their comfort over my principles, to value their acceptance more than systemic change. Realize this is exactly how workplace inequality perpetuates itself, not through overt discrimination that can be challenged through HR, but through subtle social dynamics that make resistance personally costly. Women learn to choose career success over principled advocacy, individual advancement over collective progress. They fragment potential opposition by forcing each woman to choose between belonging and beliefs. Most choose belonging, understandably, which means the system continues unchanged. My colleagues' strategy worked perfectly. They identified the feminist threat, isolated it, and neutralized it through social pressure. Now I'm living proof that women can succeed in their workplace, as long as we don't challenge their privilege too directly. The most depressing part is knowing that they genuinely believe they handled the situation well. They think they found a reasonable compromise that works for everyone. I get to keep my job and participate in office culture. They get to maintain their comfortable assumptions about gender dynamics. Everybody wins, except for the principle of equality that got sacrificed along the way. They've learned to manage feminist concerns rather than address them, to contain advocacy rather than engage with it meaningfully. It's a perfect system for maintaining the status quo while appearing progressive. They can point to my success as evidence that their workplace treats women fairly, while ignoring the fact that my success required abandoning any challenge to gender inequality. 6 months later, training a new female hire named Sarah. Watch her go through the same process I did. Initially enthusiastic about advocating for workplace equity, pointing out subtle biases and suggesting improvements to company culture. See my male colleagues' expressions when she brings up gender-inclusive language, the familiar eye rolls and uncomfortable silences. Know exactly what conversations they're having about her in the break room. Can practically hear them establishing new never be alone with her policies. The cycle is starting all over again, and I'm now part of the system that will teach her to moderate her advocacy, to choose acceptance over principles. Part of me wants to warn Sarah about what's coming, to help her navigate the social dynamics more effectively than I did. But another part of me knows that would just make me complicit in the process, teaching her to accommodate inequality rather than challenge it, showing her how to advocate for equality in ways that don't actually threaten the status quo. Instead, I watch silently as she repeats my mistakes, speaking truth to power in ways that make power uncomfortable, triggering the same defensive responses that eventually isolated me. She'll learn the same lessons I learned, about the cost of principled advocacy in environments that resist change, about how systems protect themselves by marginalizing those who challenge them. A year later, both Sarah and I have found our places in the office ecosystem. We're successful, respected, professionally fulfilled. We've learned to work within existing power structures rather than challenge them, to focus on individual achievement rather than systemic change. Our male colleagues congratulate themselves on how well they've adapted to having strong women on the team, how they've learned to value our contributions and treat us as equals. They genuinely believe they've evolved and become more enlightened. Really, they've just gotten better at managing potential threats to their privilege, more sophisticated in their methods of neutralizing feminist advocacy. They've learned to appear inclusive while maintaining exclusive control. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd persisted, if I'd refused to modify my advocacy regardless of social consequences. Maybe I would have been marginalized permanently. Maybe I would have been forced to find work elsewhere. Or maybe, just maybe, I would have eventually broken through their resistance, forced them to engage with uncomfortable truths about workplace inequality, created real change instead of the superficial accommodation we ended up with. But I'll never know because I chose the path of least resistance, the path that preserved my career at the expense of my convictions, the path that my male colleagues carefully constructed to neutralize my impact. What I know for certain is that they won, not through superior arguments or moral authority, but through superior strategy and social pressure. They figured out how to make feminism personally costly, how to isolate advocates and force them to choose between belonging and beliefs, how to maintain inequality while appearing reasonable and professional. They turned my passion for justice into a liability, my advocacy for equality into a source of workplace tension, my commitment to change into evidence of my own difficult personality. It was a masterful manipulation that left me questioning my own perceptions, wondering if maybe I really had been too confrontational, too demanding, too idealistic. The genius of their approach was making me complicit in my own silencing, convincing me that modifying my advocacy was a mature, reasonable compromise, that learning to work within existing systems was more effective than challenging them. They didn't silence me through force. They taught me to silence myself, to internalize their comfort as more important than my principles, to value their acceptance more than systemic justice. Now, when new women join the company with feminist ideals, I find myself subtly discouraging them from being too vocal, suggesting they focus on building relationships before challenging inequalities, teaching them the same lessons my male colleagues taught me about the importance of not making people uncomfortable, about picking battles carefully and moderating their approach. realize I've become part of the machinery that perpetuates workplace inequality, not through malicious intent, but through learned helplessness, through the accumulated wisdom that resistance is futile and accommodation is survival. My male colleagues successfully converted a potential agent of change into a guardian of the status quo. They didn't need to defeat my arguments. They just needed to defeat my willingness to make those arguments, to exhaust my capacity for conflict and replace it with desire for belonging. Now I help train other women to make the same compromises I made, to choose career success over principled advocacy, to work within systems of inequality rather than challenge them directly. The most painful realization is that this strategy works because it exploits genuine human needs, the need for professional acceptance, financial security, social belonging. They didn't ask me to abandon my principles outright, just to express them more diplomatically, to advocate for equality in ways that didn't threaten existing power structures, to focus on individual advancement rather than systemic change. It seemed reasonable at the time, a mature compromise that acknowledged practical realities. But really, it was a trap that neutered my effectiveness while preserving the illusion of progress. 3 years later, I'm successful by every conventional measure. Good performance reviews, salary increases, respect from colleagues, invited to company social events, consulted on important decisions, included in the informal networks that drive real organizational power. My male colleagues point to my success as evidence of their commitment to gender equality, proof that women can thrive in their workplace if they approach things the right way. The right way being their way, the way that preserves their comfort while providing opportunities for women, who learn to advocate for equality without actually challenging inequality, who focus on individual achievement rather than collective empowerment, who become success stories that justify the continued marginalization of those who won't compromise. Sitting in my office now, looking out at the bullpen where Sarah works, watch her navigate the same dynamics I once faced, see her learning the same lessons about the cost of principled advocacy, gradually moderating her approach to avoid social isolation, choosing acceptance over confrontation, becoming another success story in the company's diversity narrative. Another example of how women can succeed if they just learn to work within existing systems. I want to feel proud of how far we've both come, but mostly I feel sad about how little has actually changed. The same inequalities persist. We've just learned to accommodate them more gracefully, to succeed, despite the system, rather than transform it. My male colleagues have perfected the art of appearing progressive while maintaining control. They've learned the language of diversity and inclusion. They attend sensitivity trainings and participate in mentorship programs. They promote women who demonstrate they can succeed without challenging the fundamental power structure. They point to our achievements as evidence of their enlightened leadership, while continuing to operate according to the same assumptions about gender and power. They've successfully separated individual advancement from systemic change, allowing for female success stories while preserving male privilege, creating the appearance of progress without the substance of transformation. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if Sarah and I collaborated, if we joined forces with other women in the company, if we developed a coordinated strategy for addressing workplace inequality. But I know the answer already. We would face the same isolation and pressure that neutralized my individual efforts. Probably worse, since collective action would be seen as more threatening. They would find ways to divide us, to reward some for their cooperation while punishing others for their resistance, to maintain the illusion that individual merit determines success, while ensuring that merit is defined according to their comfort level. The system is too sophisticated to be challenged by conventional advocacy, too adaptive to be defeated by principled resistance. The real tragedy is that my male colleagues aren't evil people. They're not consciously conspiring to maintain gender inequality. They genuinely believe they've created a fair and inclusive workplace. They point to women's success as evidence of their progressive values. They celebrate diversity while preserving homogeneity of thought. They've learned to manage feminist concerns without addressing feminist critiques, to accommodate women without empowering them, to appear enlightened while maintaining traditional power structures. They've convinced themselves that they've evolved, when really they've just gotten better at neutralizing threats to their privilege. 5 years into this job, I've become everything I once criticized: a successful professional woman who validates the system by thriving within it, who demonstrates that gender equality isn't necessary because individual women can succeed, who proves that advocacy isn't needed because accommodation is sufficient. My career trajectory has become evidence against the very arguments I used to make about systemic barriers and structural inequality. My male colleagues can point to my success and ask what more women want. If I could make it here, why can't others? What's stopping them besides their own choices and attitudes? My achievement has become a weapon against women who still struggle, proof that the system works for those willing to work within it. Realize that this is the ultimate victory for those who want to preserve inequality. Not the elimination of successful women, but their conversion into advocates for the status quo. Not the silencing of feminist voices, but their transformation into testimonies for incremental progress. Not the prevention of change, but its redirection into channels that preserve existing power structures. They've learned to use our successes against our principles, to turn our achievements into arguments against systemic transformation, to make us complicit in maintaining the very inequalities we once sought to challenge. It's a more sophisticated form of oppression than outright exclusion, more effective because it enlists the oppressed in policing themselves and others. Looking back on that conversation I overheard in the break room, never be alone with her, ever. Understand now that it was just the beginning, the crude early stage of a strategy that eventually became much more refined. They learned that isolation and exclusion were too obvious, too likely to generate sympathy or legal challenges. Much better to include women while neutralizing their impact, to provide opportunities while maintaining control, to celebrate diversity while preserving uniformity of thought. My male colleagues have become masters of defensive inclusion, experts at providing access without sharing power, at creating the appearance of equality while maintaining the reality of dominance. The women who succeed in environments like this become unwitting ambassadors for inequality, living proof that the system works for those who approach it correctly. Examples of how far women can go if they just learn to navigate existing structures, rather than challenge them directly. We become case studies in individual merit overcoming supposed barriers. Evidence that systemic change isn't necessary because individual change is sufficient. Our achievements validate their approaches while invalidating our original critiques. They can point to our success and ask what more we want, why we can't be satisfied with the opportunities we've been given, why we insist on seeing discrimination where they see accommodation. Sitting here now, successful and respected and fundamentally defeated. Understand that my male colleagues never needed to win the argument about workplace equality. They just needed to win the argument about how to pursue it. To convince women like me that gradual change is more effective than direct challenge. That accommodation is more realistic than transformation. That individual success is more important than collective empowerment. They've successfully redirected feminist energy into channels that serve their interests, turned potential agents of change into testimonies for the status quo, convinced us that our compromises represent mature wisdom rather than strategic defeat. The most insidious part is how reasonable it all seems in retrospect, how logical the progression from confrontation to accommodation appears, how much sense it makes to focus on building relationships before challenging power, to work within existing systems rather than against them, to pursue individual advancement rather than systemic transformation. They've made their preferred approach seem like the only viable option, the only path that leads to real success rather than principled failure. They've trained us to police ourselves and each other, to view direct advocacy as naive and counterproductive, to see accommodation as sophisticated and strategic. What they've created is a perfect system for maintaining inequality while appearing progressive, for providing opportunities without sharing power, for celebrating diversity without embracing transformation, for managing feminist concerns without addressing feminist critiques. They've learned to turn women's ambitions against women's principles, to use our desire for success to neutralize our commitment to change, to make us complicit in maintaining the very structures we once sought to transform. It's a masterpiece of defensive strategy, more effective than any form of direct oppression, because it enlists the oppressed in policing themselves. And the worst part is knowing that this cycle will continue, that other young women will join this company with idealistic goals about creating change, that they'll face the same choices I faced between belonging and beliefs, that most will choose belonging as I did, that their successes will become evidence against the need for systemic transformation, that their achievements will be used to justify the continued marginalization of those who won't compromise, that the system will continue to perfect its methods of defensive inclusion. Learning from each generation of women how to better neutralize potential threats to existing power structures. My male colleagues have won not through superior moral authority or logical arguments, but through superior understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. They figured out how to make resistance personally costly and accommodation personally rewarding, how to isolate advocates and fragment potential opposition, how to use individual success stories to justify systemic inequality, how to appear progressive while remaining fundamentally unchanged. They've created a system that can absorb and neutralize any amount of feminist energy, turning potential agents of transformation into guardians of the status quo, converting advocates for change into testimonies for accommodation. In the end, that whispered conversation in the break room was prophetic. Never be alone with her, ever. They were right to be afraid of direct engagement with feminist advocacy, right to recognize that one-on-one conversations might lead to genuine dialogue about inequality, right to understand that their comfort depended on controlling the terms of interaction. What they figured out was that isolation wasn't the answer. Inclusion was much more effective, bringing women into the system while ensuring they become invested in maintaining it, providing success while requiring silence about the conditions that made success necessary, offering achievement while demanding gratitude for the opportunity to achieve. Now I'm alone in a much more fundamental way than I ever was when they were avoiding me, alone with the knowledge of what I've become, alone with the understanding of how completely I've been neutralized, alone with the recognition that my success validates their approach while invalidating my principles. They don't need to avoid me anymore because I've learned to avoid challenging them. Don't need to protect themselves from my advocacy because I've learned to advocate in ways that serve their interests. Don't need to isolate me because I've learned to isolate myself from anything that might threaten my carefully constructed professional relationships. I've become exactly what they wanted, a successful woman who proves their system works, while ensuring that it never has to change.